Hey, Jason Starr here, and the topic of today's video is how to co-write a novel. And this is a topic I do have a lot of experience in. Ken Bruen and I co-wrote 4 novels together. I'm still not sure how we pulled it off, how we did it, but we did do 4 novels, and the first one, Bust, was published over 10 years ago. And look, there are certain pros and cons to co-writing a novel. The big pro is theoretically you should be able to write twice as fast. So you can be a lot more productive co-writing a book. You might come up with different, cooler ideas because you have two minds conceiving of the plot. In the worst case scenario, it's going to take you much longer to write a book than it would yourself if you're not in sync with the writer. So it's hugely important that if you are thinking about co-writing a book, that you choose a partner that you're extremely compatible with. I guess it's sort of like dating or marriage in that respect. So how do you find someone you're compatible with? Well, the most important thing is that you have the same vision for the book. So it can't be in one case where somebody wants to write something with a comic tone and someone wants to be dark and serious. It's just not going to work from the get-go, and you're going to be arguing and debating which way to take the plot, and that's just going to slow you down. So Ken and I never had issues like that because although we write in very different styles, and I'll get to styles in a second, but although we write in very different styles, he's, for those of you unfamiliar with Ken, he writes, he's probably best known for the Jack Taylor novels. It's a hit series now on Netflix, and he writes in a very Irish style. Like, as I joke around with him, I write in English and you write in Irish. And it would seem in some respects, that it would be really hard for us to collaborate. If you read one of my books and you go read one of Ken's books, it would probably seem like a bad match as far as how we're going to pull off co-writing a book. So when I started writing with Ken, I did like a draft of a chapter, and then he did a polish over it, and it just seemed like 2 different voices. And then I went over it again, and I kind of in my writing, I kind of tried to write a little bit more like Ken writes, and he tried to write a little bit more like I write, and we somehow discovered our own voice. So that's how we solved the voice problem. But Ken and I never had an issue about a vision, about which direction we want the books to go in, because although our novels are very different, we both have, I guess, a dark sensibility. There's always some humor in our books, but there's always a darkness also, and neither of us were looking for that happy ending necessarily at the end of the book. I guess we have a noir sensibility. So that was key, and I think that's why you see a lot of writers' teams being mother's daughters, father's son, sort of, husband wife. You see people who know each other really well, and Ken and I are just old friends, but we are in sync. I mean, you know how it is, like when you have a friend who you're very in sync with, and you're always, years can go by and you see the person and you're sort of connect again. It has to be that sort of dynamic when you're co-writing. I think it would be very hard to co-write a book with a stranger. Now, when I talk about co-writing, I'm not talking about books that are authored like the James Patterson books, where he's working with a number of writers and he's working on conceiving those plots, and the writers are doing most of the actual writing. But I don't consider that actual co-writing. They're not going back and forth in most cases. I'm sure there are cases where he has done that, but in most cases they're not going back and forth on chapters. And that's another thing. You have to come up with your own style for how you're going to write together. Are you going to go back and forth on chapters, or figure out another way to do it? The way Ken and I often did it is I would do a lot of the plotting, and there would always be some sort of evolving outline to the whole book. But I might be working on chapter 1, and Ken would be working on chapter 5, and he would send me what he did of chapter 5, and then I would do a polish over that, and then go back to working on 1, and I would ask Ken to add some things in certain spots to 1. One thing about Ken is he only likes, he's a big fan of doing one draft. So doing rewrites with Ken is always a challenge, but we always found our strategies of doing it. And amazingly, we never had one conflict when writing those books. So that's the best case scenario, when you don't have any conflict and you're kind of in sync. And another way not to have conflict is one person, and this is extremely important in co-writing, one person has to be the one who's plotting, and the other person has to be the one who's doing writing, also doing some plotting, but more of like there has to be like a quarterback and a running back, someone who makes the big plays. It's really hard to have two quarterbacks on the team, or you have to trade off, and like one person is in charge of the plotting, and one person is in charge of writing the big action scenes or something like that, or write to your strengths. So there would be cases where I would write an entire chapter, but there had to be some murder scene in a chapter, and I know Ken is great at that, so sometimes I would just hand it off to him. So you have to know each other's strengths, each other's weaknesses, and you want to have no ego. That's a huge factor also. Like when you're co-writing a book, you can't worry about whose line is being used, whose idea. You have to have the idea that you're creating another voice. It's not the two individual voices anymore. You're creating a new voice. And if Ken came up with a line that was better than mine, or I came up with one that was better than his, we both embraced it. And at this point, like, we don't even know who wrote what. Like, years have gone by since that first book, and both of us experienced like picking it up, and we don't know who wrote what, and we kind of forgot because it just seems like we both wrote it. So that's my tips on co-writing, and I do recommend it. It probably is not the best idea if you're working on your first book, but at some point it is something to give a shot if you have someone you're compatible with, and if you think you have an idea that would benefit from having a co-writer. The books I wrote with Ken are definitely funnier than they would have been if we had tried to write those individually. I just think we pushed each other into making it funnier, making it wackier at times, and even in the plot, taking it in directions we probably wouldn't have gone in alone. So give it a shot if you're up for it. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, share it on social media, and I'll be back for more soon.